Under fire in British Columbia. Mounties targeted at a native standoff. On alert in Paris. Bomb blasts put the city on edge.
Sunday Report with Nancy Wilson.
Good evening. 2 RCMP officers were caught in a hail of automatic weapons fire today near the site of a native standoff in British Columbia. Police say they were hit in the back as they ran for cover, but their flak jackets saved them from serious injury. This is the latest development in a tense standoff at Gustafsen Lake between a small group of natives and the RCMP. Police have been blocking access to the camp for several days and warning that they will end the native occupation of private land with force if necessary. As Eve Savory reports, today's shooting may have dealt a serious blow to any hope of a peaceful settlement.
It was 3 o'clock when it happened. Someone had felled a log over the road that leads to the camp. Police escorted forestry workers in to remove the log.
As they alighted from the police vehicle to attend to the tree, they were met in an ambush situation. They encountered several rounds of machine gun fire, and our police vehicle has been disabled. As a result, they had to run for cover. 2 of our members were hit. It appears that the bulletproof vest probably saved their lives. They're not injured. They've been checked over. There's no need for hospitalization.
Tell me what's happening. Someone tell me what's
Back in town, a supporter of those in the camp was distraught, convinced police would now move in.
I need to kill those people. I need to kill those people.
It had all the earmarks of an ambush. They were on both sides of the road, and the rounds were coming from both sides, and they were caught in the crossfire. We have no idea how many slugs hit our vehicle.
The fact that 2 police officers were shot at is a criminal act. It is an act of attempted murder. It cannot be condoned and will not be supported by the Indian people across the land.
That was Ovid Mercredi, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, speaking a few minutes ago in 100 Mile House, BC. Joining me now on the phone is the CBC's Eve Savory. Eve, Chief Mercredi was critical of both natives and the police in this incident. Does he see himself as having a future role in trying to defuse the situation?
Yes, Nancy, he does. He was very critical of the police. He felt that in his other days of mediation, he had pleaded with the police not to keep on this pincher movement, this moving in closer and closer. And because they did move closer and closer, he feels this happened. He feels the RCMP strategy led to violence, but he is not giving up on the situation. He said although he is not willing to go in, he has a wife and a family, and he says it is not safe. He still is interested in trying to make radio contact in order to reduce the sense of heightened crisis and siege mentality that he says is building in there.
And what about the RCMP? Have police indicated as to how they intend to proceed?
Well, interestingly enough, they said that whether or not Mercredi might be allowed to make radio contact is under discussion. So they are still open to mediative efforts, but they will not say more. They say the operational plan is in full effect. And there is one other note I'd like to make to point out how sensitive and difficult this issue is becoming. People at the press conference who have members of their family in the camp were saying to the media, this is a setup. The police have set this up so that they can have an excuse to go in.
All right, Eve Savory, thanks very much for this.
Thank you.
This crisis has been a long time in the making. The armed camp is on land bought by a rancher in the 1970s. Land the native protesters say is rightfully theirs. After finding people living on the property, the rancher sent an eviction notice last June, but the notice was ignored. Later, our Sunday Report panel will look beyond the standoff at Gustafsen Lake. The question, is this country seeing a rise in native militancy? To other news and some wild weather around Regina. A powerful storm pelted the area with rain and hail last night, damaging buildings and toppling trees. As Jennifer Jensen reports, one town reported damage to virtually every home.
Greg Ellis says it'll take a while to clean up his yard and even longer to get over yesterday's storm.
It's like a bomb went off. It's amazing.
It rolled in quickly late in the afternoon. Some trees were snapped in half. Many of those left standing had their leaves and bark stripped off. The wind was so powerful it toppled grain bins. It even picked up a combine and tossed it several hundred meters into a ditch. 9 people were injured, mostly from flying glass.
Holy I get it.
Hail smashing down by the bucketful also left a big mess here. 2 horses caught in the storm are covered with fist-sized welts and cuts, their eyes swollen shut.
Come on, people!
While most people are cleaning up, others are trying to control the steady flow of curious onlookers. At this farm, they saw buildings leveled, equipment mangled. The list goes on and on. Environment officials aren't sure if all the damage is from the hailstorm or if a tornado touched down here. But whatever it was, cleaning up the mess will be a huge job.
Months. It's going to take months. Plus, we're coming into harvest. We had just been swathing, and now all of a sudden one combine's on the side of the highway, this one's smashed up. So it's going to take a long time to come back around.
The storm will keep some other farmers from harvesting at all. The hail and wind pounded crops into the ground. Jennifer Jensen, CBC News, Pilot Butte, Saskatchewan.
Parts of the Caribbean are taking a pounding from Tropical Storm Iris. The storm killed 2 people in Martinique before moving in the direction of Puerto Rico. The last gasp of another tropical storm is causing havoc in the southeastern United States. Jerry brought serious flooding to parts of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Some people were caught off guard. This man had to be rescued from the raging water. It has been one of the worst hurricane seasons in decades. Another bomb has been found in France. It was spotted by a train conductor along one of the country's high-speed rail lines. Authorities say the gas canister bomb was placed beside the tracks just north of Lyon. It was set up to explode when a train went by, but never did. This new scare comes after 2 recent bombings in Paris killed 7 people, and police are convinced more attacks are coming. Here's our new Paris correspondent, Paul Workman.
On perhaps the most famous avenue in the world, all of the garbage cans have been sealed and bolted shut. It's not a new French invention, more like an old French nightmare. Bombs in downtown Paris. A popular new Hollywood restaurant has canceled plans for a glitzy opening this week. Thousands of police have been put on red alert all over the city. Most tourists are confident it could never happen to them. So are most of the French.
I think it's less dangerous in Paris now than to take a car and drive on the road.
If somebody really wanted to plant a bomb somewhere, they can always do it.
2 bombings in the space of a month, 7 killed, more than 100 wounded. French police blame Islamic fundamentalists from Algeria. It seems the war there has come to this country. A former head of the French intelligence service believes this is only the beginning.
They have thought for quite a number of years that a day will come when the Algerian terrorists will act on France.
3 million Algerians live in France, and that makes a fertile base for an Islamic bombing network. The majority, though, feel labeled and resentful. They are not terrorists, just poor Arab immigrants.
On aimerait bien les flics qu'ils soient un peu on nous traite comme les êtres humains.
We'd like the cops to start treating us like human beings, he says. This Arab man gets special treatment in one of the city's train stations, all of a sudden surrounded by security guards. Some passengers are being searched before they're allowed on board. Every train is being searched before it leaves the station, every compartment, every toilet. The French government is taking this very seriously.
They are certainly quite aware of the fact that it could create a very difficult situation in France, a situation of almost panic in France.
The police here in France have only one suspect, an Algerian living in Sweden whose link to the actual bombing is questionable. For now then, about all the country can do is put a lot of police on the street and wait for the next attack to happen. Paul Workman, CBC News, Paris.
There's been another bombing in Montreal linked to the violent turf war between bike gangs. A Molotov cocktail blew out the windows of this tattoo parlor. The shop is connected to a bike gang called Rock Machine. It's been battling the Hells Angels for control over Montreal's drug trade. There were no injuries in today's bombing or in two similar attacks yesterday. Thousands of people from around the world began arriving in Beijing today for a conference on the status of women. The Chinese government is trying to present a positive image, but as our Beijing correspondent Patrick Brown reports, it may be trying a little too hard.
Beijing is being painted and polished for the United Nations Women's Conference next month. And part of the Tidy Up campaign was to move the overlapping forum of non-governmental organizations out of town. About an hour and a half's drive from Beijing, the town of Huairou is in a frenzy of last-minute preparations for the opening of the forum on Wednesday. One thing that will be ready on time is security. Metal detectors are being installed everywhere, and Huairou's police force of a few hundred has swollen to several thousand. The force includes a showcase detachment of police women. Special training seems to combine the skills of a riot squad and a dance troupe. The extra security and the move to Huairou reflect the Chinese realization that non-governmental organizations can include human rights activists, lesbians, and prostitutes. China has no respect for diversity of opinion and fears demonstrations. Housing and conference venues, this one air-conditioned by the omission of walls and a roof, have been thrown together in weeks. But the women of the world will make this work come what may, says Executive Director Irene Santiago. The site will be ready, and if there's controversy, so much the better.
I have a very, very positive view of conflict. If there are controversies, there will be controversies, because I think that there is not going to be any kind of structural or fundamental change without controversy.
China's attempt to isolate ideas and activities it doesn't care for has created logistical headaches, and it's drawn attention to the totalitarian nature of the country. No matter how well organized the conference finally turns out to be, many delegates will take exception to being placed in quarantine. Patrick Brown, CBC News, Huairou.
When we come back, our panel on a summer of native protest, a look beyond the blockades. And later, this story.
He's done so much for this community. I mean, I can't see why anyone would want to be like him.
He's talking about this man, a man devoted to cleaning up a tough part of St. John's. That's Local Hero coming up on Sunday Report.
Operation Cutback on Venture tonight. One hospital's radical surgery on spending and the man behind it.
We are doing our best, and I think we're realizing our best is not going to be good enough. The numbers are appalling.
The Business of Health, tonight on Venture, right after Sunday Report.
If you read the coroner's report involving OCA, there is some strong recommendations in that report where the police must never have absolute power.
The public expect the RCMP to take action. We have the complete ministerial support to take this action, and that's exactly where we are.
Some have questioned the legitimacy of the Gustafsen Lake protest, but as you can see, police are certainly taking it extremely seriously. It isn't the first Native protest this summer. Other groups have blocked roads, and there was that standoff over fishing on New Brunswick's Miramichi River. Is there a connection between these events? Is there a frustration out there that's breeding a new militancy? That's the jumping off point for our panel tonight. Joining me from Victoria, Stephen Hume. He's a columnist with the Vancouver Sun who has covered Aboriginal issues for some 30 years. In Toronto, freelance investigative journalist Jim Moses, and in Ottawa tonight, Globe and Mail columnist Jeffrey Simpson. Stephen Hume, this situation in BC is just the latest in a number of blockades both in your province and elsewhere in the country. Why is this happening now?
Well, I think there's a growing level of frustration amongst a number of younger, more militant Aboriginal members of the community who are losing their sense that the traditional process is taking them anywhere. We have not demonstrated the political will on the part of our own governments to resolve these outstanding grievances, some of which go back 100 years. And until we do, we can expect that, that this kind of frustration level is going to grow. If we don't give moderate Aboriginal leaders something to take back to their communities and their memberships to show that the process is working, we can expect that young people who are coming up behind them are going to start pushing them out of the way and taking the agenda themselves.
All right, Jim Moses, is that how you see it? Is there a simmering frustration giving rise to a new wave of militancy?
I think it would be a mistake to justify the militancy that's taking place right now with any kind of political agenda. The blockades and the seizures of property and that sort of thing that are taking place right now really have no reflection on the community, are being carried out by people who have private reasons for doing what they're doing. The Miramichi is a good example. There was only a very small group and they were repudiated by their own community. And the same thing is happening in BC right now. Very small group, repudiated by the local community.
Well, even if we're not talking about a pervasive sense that militancy and these kind of acts should be sanctioned, do you acknowledge, though, that there is a certain level of dissatisfaction out there that's creating a climate that is giving rise to these eruptions of violence and defiance?
If there is something good to come out of this, is that the idea that the moderate leaders have to be encouraged in their moderation. But I have to repeat myself. I think it would be a mistake to try and read too much into the radicalism that's taking place right now, because it isn't really representative of the communities where it's taking place.
Well, Jeffrey, if there is considerable frustration out there for the process, to what extent are federal and provincial governments responsible for fueling this frustration?
Well, they are responsible to the extent that they have made commitments and timetables which they haven't been able to honor. There's a wonderful case in Stevens Province, British Columbia, the Nisga'a, the northwestern part of the province, who are very moderate and who have been negotiating in good faith for a very long time. And all of a sudden, about a month ago, the British Columbia government walked away from the negotiations because of a disagreement with Ottawa over a cost-sharing formula. That's the classic federal-provincial dispute. We read about them all the time. And the Nisga's are really innocent bystanders in all of this. I want to just make the following point. It's very interesting in the Gustafsen Lake case. I agree with Jim Moses. It looks like a group of very radical people have taken that situation and blown it up because the local band is not in favor. The British Columbia umbrella Aboriginal organizations have been largely silent on the issue. And when the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Ovid McCurdy, flew out there, he could accomplish nothing either. So that the traditional Aboriginal leadership on a national and provincial basis, which we saw during the Charlottetown Accord when it was repudiated by the rank and file of Aboriginals, is really quite ineffective.
Well, Jim, what about that? The kind of frustration and challenge that's being put not just to political leaders in governments, but also to Native leaders. Are you seeing a real discussion about whether or not to embrace or reject militancy?
I think there were some very significant occurrences this summer. Ovid McCurdy himself asked for a national day of protest. Nothing happened. He also asked for someone to occupy Ron Owen's office. Nothing happened. A lot of chiefs failed to show up for the Assembly of First Nations summer meeting. And I think this was sort of a below-the-table announcement that they don't want to be dragged down the militant road. And I think the small bands of independent dissidents who are staging these events across the country right now are illegitimately seizing the attention of the media and not contributing to the solution of the real problems at all.
Well, Nancy, if I could just interrupt, something very important happened 2 or 3 weeks ago in Ottawa, and that is that the federal government, the federal Liberal government, in effect said, we're not going to worry about the Assembly of First Nations, which has got so much attention. They put out a document about self-government, which has been the core of Aboriginal Canadians' demands for the last 15 years. And it was immediately rejected by the AFN, and the government knew it would be rejected by the AFN, but they thought they could go right over the heads of this leadership to ordinary chiefs and band members across the country who want to make progress rather than getting caught in the swamps of constitutional reform.
Well, Stephen, isn't that what you were talking about, that to some extent the political leaders are not giving the moderates within the Native constituency a chance to have a voice in this process?
Well, absolutely. We have a case, another case which is not so well known here in British Columbia. The McLeod Lake Band has been trying to win adhesion to Treaty 8, which was signed in 1899, basically to obtain for themselves their treaty rights to 1 square mile of land for every family of 5. They've been engaged in a lengthy negotiation with the provincial government. On 3 separate occasions now, they have drafted a memorandum in principle which covered all of their grievances and gave them the claim that they wished. And at each case, the provincial government has refused to sign the final document, and their negotiator has resigned on a point of principle. Now, I don't know how long this kind of thing can go on, but at one point or another, the chief of that band is going to have to go back to his people and say, I simply can't accomplish what I've promised to accomplish, and the provincial government won't let me accomplish it. Where does it go then? I mean, I think that is where much of the kind of frustration that we see arising now is coming from. And it does have to be said that while the Gustafsen Lake situation is not in any way reflective of the general attitudes of the Aboriginal community in British Columbia, I think this group has been repudiated by every legitimate source in the province. It does reflect a kind of ad hoc militancy that is emerging deep within these communities. We have one of the highest birth rates in Canada in the Aboriginal community, one of the highest birth rates in the world, in fact. As these young people come up onto reserves where there's 80% unemployment, where their life expectancy is 30 years less than yours or mine, I think we can see a growing level of frustration with them in the inability of their own moderate leaders to resolve the problem. So I agree with Jim that unless we can empower those moderate leaders, unless we can encourage them to deal realistically with the government, unless the government can show some will to give them something to take back to their communities, those young people are going to run away with the agenda.
Well, Jim, to what extent is what we're seeing unfold today in various parts of the country, to what extent is this partly the legacy of Oka?
Oka is a good example. Oka is largely regarded by most people across Canada as a legitimate issue. There was a legitimate land claim. However, the people that were arguing the point weren't legitimately supported by the Iroquois Confederacy, the same group that they claimed to be subservient to. They weren't upholding the laws of the Great Law, even though they claimed to be doing that. The warriors hijacked the legitimate issue at Oka, which was the land claim, and used it for their own purposes. And I think this is one of the misleading points of view that has been adopted by people across the country through the media, that militancy in some respects can be respectable.
Nancy, can I add that Steve Hume is right about the generational challenge coming up. He's right that the federal and provincial governments have been tardy when they haven't been duplicitous in dealing with various Aboriginal groups. All of that is true. But in his province, it doesn't help on the other side when the land claims that have been laid down equal more than the territorial mass of British Columbia. In other words, there is a kind of lack of realism on the part of some of the Aboriginal groups that impedes public understanding and erodes public sympathy and makes it easier for governments that want to be duplicitous or difficult to be just that.
Hey, come on, it's a negotiation. I mean, they've gone to the table, and they're asking for the most they can get. They're not going to go to the table, tug their little forelocks, and ask for the least they can get.
Stephen, nobody's asking anybody to tug forelocks, but when you put down claims that total more than the territorial landmass of the province, you understandably, I think, I don't think you have to be radical in saying this, you understandably cause a lot of apprehension on the part of the majority of people in the province. And you may say, well, that's just a negotiating position, but nevertheless, nobody knows how negotiations will end.
Well, much to talk about, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it at that. I thank you all for talking to us tonight.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Good night.
Good night.